Welcome back as we return to our top story tonight, and that is Donald Trump has been elected the 47th president of the United States in a victory that has been hailed as a stunning political comeback. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says Singapore stands ready to work closely with Mr. Trump in advancing bilateral ties and the U.S. partnerships in the Asia-Pacific. Now, Republicans have won control of the U.S. Senate, retaking the chamber for the first time in 4 years. Now, that puts the Republican Party in position to play a far larger role in determining key policies, as well as appointing justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. Prior to the election, there were expectations that results would not be known for days. But the swing states have seemed to pull through for the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. Simon Marks tells us if the race was really as tight as projected.
Well, I think there's no question that it was a close race. I mean, at the moment, Donald Trump has 51.9% of the vote to Kamala Harris's 47.2% of the vote. And there were moments during the last few weeks of the campaign when polls suggested that a sort of a 2 or 3 point gap between the two of them, Kamala Harris was often ahead of him in those final weeks of the polls, was to be expected. I mean, it is, though, the size of the victory and the size of the surge in support for Donald Trump and the ebbing away of support for Kamala Harris that has stunned Democrats and allowed the result of the election finally to be called by the major television networks in the very early hours of this morning. I think around 5:30 East Coast time was when the final call came. And for Democrats, this is an overwhelming drubbing. By the time this finishes, it could end up looking a lot like a Donald Trump landslide, and not just in terms of the presidency. The Republicans have captured the Senate. It is perfectly possible that by the time all the House races are resolved, the Republicans will enjoy a majority in the House of Representatives as well.
Well, the next president is not due in office until January next year. Simon Marks once more tells us if we can expect major moves from the Biden administration before that time comes.
Well, I mean, there's very little that they can do. I mean, first of all, in practical terms, the House of Representatives, the old House of Representatives has a Republican majority, a razor-thin one, and the old Senate has a razor-thin Democrat majority. So legislatively, in practical terms, there's not very much Biden can get done. I mean, he can try and pass some, issue some executive orders to try and shore up some aspects of his legacy. But the Democratic Party is about to get convulsed by internecine warfare, the recriminations that are now going to follow Kamala Harris's defeat, the questions about why Joe Biden didn't give way to a younger generation of leaders 18 months ago, allowing for a competitive primary, questions for Democratic Party grandees, including the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, even Barack and Michelle Obama, who were telling that younger generation they just needed to cool it. They weren't going to get their opportunity this time around. The party was stuck with Joe Biden. With only 107 days for Kamala Harris to try and mount a successful campaign for the presidency, that was always going to be a steep climb, no matter the extent to which Democrats swooned before her feet in relief when Joe Biden finally abandoned his re-election quest. Remember also that Donald Trump has, by dint of securing this victory, essentially managed to acquire himself almost literally a get-out-of-jail-free card, because as president he is going to be able to terminate the traditional but not constitutionally guaranteed independence of the Department of Justice. The remaining federal criminal charges against him relating to his efforts allegedly to subvert the outcome of the 2020 election are sure to be dropped. He will have the opportunity, if he wants to launch criminal probes of his own through a pliant attorney general of some of his enemies. So Democrats, between now and January the 20th, I mean, there is very little they can do to head off that reality, or even the reality of the potential deportations of hundreds of thousands of migrants from this country. The Democrats are in real trouble here this morning.
All right, let's turn our attention to China, Washington's largest rival. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says the election is an internal affair for America and they respect the people's choice. On whether Trump's victory will affect China and U.S. relations, well, here's what a spokesperson had to say.
我们对美国的政策是一以贯之的，我们将继续按照相互尊重、和平共处、合作共赢的原则看待和处理中美关系。
During the previous Trump administration, there were some hot-button issues straining U.S.-China ties. Olivia Seong tells us more about those issues and if they're likely to flare up under a second Trump leadership.
Well, the big factor here and what analysts have been saying is going to be the challenge is uncertainty with Mr. Trump back in the White House, whether it's on the American alliances and their approach to China in the South China Sea or with regard to the self-ruled island of Taiwan. Although China continues to hold the view that America, there is bipartisan consensus that views American actions as trying to contain its rise. But perhaps the top issue on people's minds is trade. During his first term, Mr. Trump called himself the tariff man, and on the campaign trail, he has talked about tariffs on imported goods with additional tariffs of about 60% on Chinese goods that he is intending to put in place. Of course, that's campaign talk. Whether they will actually come into fruition remains to be seen, but when asked how China would handle more potential tariffs, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said it does not answer hypothetical questions. But ING Bank did say in a note that this could be just the start of negotiations between two sides. But in the long run, we have already seen China hedging against what it views as an increasingly competitive relationship with the U.S. So we hear increasing talk about a need for self-reliance and for innovation, especially in advanced technologies, whether it's solar panels or electric vehicles.
Well, for more on what Mr. Trump's win means for Singapore, I'm joined by Dr. Adrian Ang, Research Fellow and Coordinator of the U.S. program at NTU's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Also with us is Associate Professor Chong from the Department of Political Science at NUS. Welcome, gentlemen. So here we are. Let's start with the positives, if we may. Dr. Ang, first to you. With Trump potentially heading to the White House, we've sort of been here before, haven't we? What can we assess from his policies, his style that could inform Singapore-US relations, especially in the area of, let's say, security, regional partnership, and also trade?
That's a very good question, Jill. Again, thank you for having me here, and happy to be with Ian as well. So, as you said, right, we have been here with Trump before. And I think, when we look at Trump's policies, we also have to remember that the Biden administration also continued a great deal of policies from the Trump administration. So its Indo-Pacific strategy was heavily influenced by the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And I expect the new Trump administration 2.0 to have a great deal of continuity as well. So, and with President Trump, we just have to also be able to discern the signal from the noise, right, and pay more attention to what he does than what he says.
Interesting, Prof. Chong, that Dr. Ang used the word continuity because he's called a disruptor. Are you in agreement with this assessment?
So I think there is going to be a degree of continuity. I think within the Republican Party, and also the Democrats for that matter, there is a view that the United States is in a competitive relationship with the PRC that will persist. What will be somewhat different is how perhaps President Trump might pursue this competition, right? We have seen different voices. I mean, he's talked about increasing tariffs, but we also have seen other people who might make it into the administration talk about shifting focus away from Europe and towards more of a containment type approach in Asia. We've seen still other voices who talk about pulling together U.S. alliances and partnerships to full-on compete with the PRC. So those are different variations of how that competition could look like.
Interesting, and I want to zero in on China for a start. Dr. Trump was saying that he has plans to, as we mentioned, revise these tariffs, revisit them, potentially deepening this trade war with China. What strategies could us, watching from the sidelines in Singapore, actually employ to safeguard our economy and maintain our position as a regional global trading hub?
So here, we are probably better placed to deal with that now than we were in 2016, 2017 when Trump took office. So it was a shock to the region when Trump pulled out of TPP. But the rest of the countries that were signatory to that continued, right? And we now have CPTPP.
Yes.
We have RCEP. And just last month at the ASEAN summit, right, they've agreed to carry out China, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So what Singapore has to do is to work with like-minded states, and there are plenty in the region. There's also the European Union, who are committed to maintaining the multilateral trading order, and hope that one day, right, the populist protectionist sentiment, right, goes away,
Shifts.
right? And there are, again, provisions in the CPTPP for the U.S. to rejoin the agreement.
All right, so there's a sort of plan B, if you like to say. But what if decoupling persists? It's taken to that end of decoupling, maybe de-risking at best between the U.S. and China economies under this second Trump administration. Do we have to buckle our belts here in Singapore? How might that impact us in the vital tech sector, especially?
So in terms of tech, I fully expect the U.S. to tighten restrictions. Those restrictions were going to be tightened regardless of whether Harris won or Trump won. And it's not just Singapore, but the countries of the region have benefited as supply chains have moved outside of China, right? De-risking the China plus one strategy. So all countries have to prepare, right, for greater scrutiny of these restrictions, right? It promises, right, benefits for the regions, but there's also downside as the U.S. prepares to scrutinize some of these supply
and maybe
chains.
To some extent it's been built in, to future strategies. But Prof. Chong, bring you in here. He's also signaled some U.S. policy changes when it comes to Taiwan. Basically, look, you're going to have to pay, for your defense. How might that affect regional security dynamics? And again, Singapore riding the waves that come from that. How might it affect us?
So I think with regard to Taiwan, the language about getting Taiwan to pay, that's not different from what Trump has described the relationship with U.S. allies as as the way that it should be.
Yeah.
We've seen this in the first Trump administration in the language that he used towards NATO. Towards South Korea, towards Japan. So this is an extension of that reasoning. I suppose one of the things that we might want to pay attention to is whether the PRC decides that this is an opportunity for them to push harder on Taiwan, and whether that push, they are already sending military aircraft and ships around Taiwan very periodically. Now, whether that push leads to some sort of escalation, some sort of accident, that, it becomes very difficult to pull back from. So I think that's what we have to watch out for. I do want to very quickly go back to what Adrian had said. I think where we're different today from 2016 is that the world is far more protectionist. The PRC has the dual circulation, the internal circulation. The European Union has turned more protectionist. They're talking about overcapacity. Even our neighbors, Indonesia and Thailand, are talking in that same language. So while there's still hope for openness, and that's what Singapore thrives on, I think we have to be prepared for an environment that is perhaps less welcoming than was the case before.
That's an interesting point. So, we need all the currency we can get as a small country in Singapore to actually survive these currents. Prof. Chong, just stay with you. I want to take you back to the Trump-Kim summit. It did, in many ways, raise Singapore's diplomatic credibility, profile, on the global stage. Are there any legacy benefits from working closely with that Trump administration that we could, perhaps bring forward and inform our Prime Minister on his foreign policy moving forward?
I think the Trump-Kim summit was an opportunity that came about that allowed Singapore to put itself on the world map as a platform that would be helpful in facilitating difficult conversations. But those opportunities don't always come about, and they can fizzle out. So we've seen the Vietnamese try to do something similar between Trump and Kim. It didn't work out. So in terms of legacy, I mean, sure, we've put ourselves sort of on the map as a platform, but beyond that, I don't think the Trump-Kim meeting itself had that much of a legacy. But what's useful for it is that, it provides a roadmap of some possibilities.
All right, Dr. Ang, perhaps I can move on to this whole idea of having to choose between US and China. We've always said, look, we don't need to support anyone, but can that actually, is that non-choice actually still valid going forward? And how can Singapore navigate this delicate geopolitical balance?
So the short answer is carefully, right?
Carefully.
So we have not reached, I think, a point either in right, sort of any of the possible flashpoints in the region, be it the South China Sea, be it the Taiwan Strait, where countries in the region have to make a choice. But this doesn't mean that the countries of the region shouldn't plan ahead for any future contingencies. So I think that is where, right, Southeast Asian states have to start really thinking. Even though they do not have to make choices now, it is very likely than not that they will have to make choices at some point in the future.
Yeah, let me jump onto that for a moment.
In 15 seconds,
Sure.
Prof.
So I think the thing about a non-choice, right, it also assumes that there's enough profit, there's enough gain from it, but that could become increasingly difficult and risky as competition between the US and the PRC increases and intensifies.
Understand. I do appreciate you both coming in here. It's been so enlightening. Thank you for dropping by. Well, I've been speaking there with Dr. Adrian Ang, coordinator of the US program at RSIS at NTU Singapore, and Associate Professor Chong Jia Ian from NUS.